Good day, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our Phase 4 CAQH Core Operating Rule Connectivity Implementation Experience webinar with PocketDoc and Binatal. Before we begin, I'd like to mention some logistical items. You can download a copy of today's presentation from the CAQH.org website. To do so, navigate to the Core pull-down menu at the top of the CAQH.org welcome screen and select the Core Education Events page. A link to the PDF version of the presentation can be found under the listing for today's webinar. We will save time at the end of today's program dedicated to responding to audience questions. You're encouraged to submit your questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. We do ask that when you submit your question, you identify the type of organization that you're with so we can give you a more accurate response. We would like to thank our guest speakers from PocketDoc and Binatal for joining us today. We will properly introduce them a little bit later in the program, but want to extend our appreciation to Faye Bolbian, Director of EDI Services at PocketDoc, and Raja Kailar, CEO of Binatal. Today we have a lot of information to share with you. We will start off with background on the Phase 4 rules. Then we will hear from PocketDoc, a provider-facing vendor and early adopter who recently implemented the connectivity requirements of the voluntary Phase 4 operating rules as part of beta testing the Phase 4 certification test suite. After hearing about PocketDoc's experience, you'll receive a technical orientation from Binatal on the Phase 4 connectivity requirements. And then, in a Q&A format, we will talk to our guest speakers about how the connectivity rules can enhance interoperability, efficiency, and security. And we will, of course, have time at the end of the session for your questions. And now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, CAQH Core Associate Director, Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And just as Jessica mentioned, I do want to provide just a quick overview of the scope of the Phase 4 operating rule requirements. As you can see, the rules do specify specific requirements for the prior authorization, the claim, the enrollment-disenrollment transaction, as well as the premium payment. These requirements are specific to infrastructure, and they specify very specific requirements around processing modes, acknowledgments, as well as the safe harbor connectivity and security requirements, system availability, and companion guide. Please note there are specific requirements around specific transactions because the core participants felt that these transactions required very nuanced and very specific requirements. So check the operating rules themselves for specifics on those particular requirements. On the next slide, you'll see that we do have very specific requirements around voluntarily implementing the Phase 4 rules, because your organization can actually do this now, as we've seen with PocketDoc, and establish yourself as a leader in the industry as an early adopter. You can determine your own timetable of what works best for you as an early adopter. You can demonstrate your organization's commitment to administrative simplification, as well as build on the work that you've done in the previous phases, because again, as you'll see a little bit later, Phase 4 builds on Phase 1, 2, and 3, so you can build momentum within your organization and use some of the same resources that are in place today. Moving on to our value proposition, again, by implementing the Phase 4 rules and taking on those tasks for these specific transactions, you can reduce cost and overhead, you can increase your efficiencies, and many of these are related specific to the requirements of the transaction. For example, response times acknowledgments help remove the black hole. No transactions can fall into that black hole. Your providers are better informed. They won't be spending their time on web portals or on your phone lines asking for information about these particular transactions. More importantly, providers can immediately learn if their claim submissions have moved successfully into the adjudication system, because the requirements for the 837 does require the 277 claim acknowledgement transaction. So a big step forward for providers. Providers can immediately learn whether the plan is received and review the prior authorization as well. The safe harbor ensures that providers can connect online for all of their transactions using the preferred connection method. So now they can submit eligibility through that message as well as a claim. Providers can improve coordination of benefits through more timely eligibility information from the health plan and knowledge of plans requirements for COB, because those are now required to be published in the health plan's companion guide. Health plans can build on investments already made in infrastructure for eligibility, claim status, EFT, and ERA, because those were the transactions covered in the previous phases. Now, just as we do want to focus a little bit on the connectivity requirements in today's presentation, a quick overview of the requirements for Phase 4 connectivity rule. This rule, again, builds off phases 1, 2, and 3 and the requirements for the connectivity there related to the core safe harbor principle. This requires a specific set of connectivity requirements and security requirements related to how the entities can conduct the transaction. This does enable trading partners to use other communication methods and security methods that are not specified in the rule. It just allows for at least one pathway that all covered entities can support for these transactions. Again, you are required to support at least the core connectivity safe harbor principle. Any other type of connectivity or safe harbor requirements, or any other type of connectivity or security requirements can still be supported. So if you have that hospital system in your neck of the woods that loves to submit their claims using the SFTP site, they can continue to do that. But you may have providers that wish to submit those claims through the core required safe harbor connectivity method, and you're required to support that type of connectivity for those providers as well. With that, I'd like to turn over the call to PocketDoc, Faye Beaubien, who is the Director of EDI Services at PocketDoc. She manages PocketDoc's trading partner relationships with payers and helped establish some formal agreements with more than 392 health insurers during her tenure. These are used for digital health plan enrollment management, to check eligibility for health services based on a patient's insurance plan, to pre-authorize specialist referrals, and submit claims, for example. As a core member of the engineering team, she is involved in documentation, quality assurance, and implementation support. She's a graduate from the University of Michigan and has been timely involved in the core certification process. Welcome, Faye.
Hi, thank you so much. So yeah, I would like to start off and talk a little bit about what PocketDoc does. So PocketDoc connects the business of health through interoperable cloud-based services to streamline business operations and deliver modern patient access solutions. In addition, so PocketDoc's mission is to enable the patient experiences, business models, and security, especially, that healthcare deserves through fluid data and modern software. So on the next slide, we'll show a little bit about a few of PocketDoc's solutions, which covers the clearinghouse services, patient access, scheduling, identity management, as well as payment optimization. So for Phase 4 certification, all of our CAQH certifications were for the clearinghouse services that we're going to talk about. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the transactions that Bob mentioned from enrollment to eligibility. Again, for Phase 4, the transactions that were impacted here were authorizations and claims in this case here. So yeah, just a little bit about what PocketDoc does. And on the next slide, the reason why. So a little bit about PocketDoc security and compliance. So compliance is native to everything we do. All of our solutions, our processes, and development are sort of built with the integrated security and compliance at their core. We meet or exceed the latest security standards. Currently, Phase 3 CAQH certified, as well as HIPAA and PCI compliant. We have a few certifications in progress. So when CAQH approached us to be a beta tester, we absolutely said yes, saying, yeah, we'll definitely be on board and be the first clearinghouse to work through this. So that's basically the reason why PocketDoc chose to go ahead and implement this on the earlier side. next slide, please. Thank you. So part of our planning for phase 4, as with the other phases, it required just reviewing the requirements, understanding and reviewing the stakeholder types and differences in the requirements, assembling a great team. You know, we had an EDI analyst, software engineer, and DevOps to sort of understand impact and sort of coordinate that, those efforts there. So in terms of execution, again, cross-team collaboration was very huge to make sure that anywhere from the EDI perspective to development perspective, we were covered. And we sort of split up tasks as the roles needed. So our awesome EDI analyst was in charge of getting the requirements together and making sure they were split up correctly, and handed them off for our developers to implement these tasks and coordinate with the testing site. And some of the benefits of the phase 4 early adoption would be, you know, definitely gaining an understanding of the industry changes and being able to proactively plan to make these changes. I think you guys mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you know, instead of waiting for the mandate, understanding ahead of time what the impact would be to systems and operations. Absolutely. And I think back to Jessica. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Faye. We appreciate you know, working with you as partners, and look forward to, you know, talking to you a little bit more during the dialogue portion of the webinar. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Raja Kailar, who's the CEO of Benatal, and he will take us through the phase 4 connectivity requirement applicability. Pardon me. Raja, feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Jessica?
Loud and clear. Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'm going to go over some of the applicability and scope of the core connectivity rule for the phase 4, and then we'll drill down into the technical details around the technical requirements of the connectivity rule. So at a high level, the key features of phase 4 connectivity rule are in two broad areas. One is the technical improvements, and the other one is the transaction support. In the area of technical improvements relative to the previous phases, we have improved based on some of the feedback that we received from implementers of previous phases. The security, the interoperability of the connectivity rule has improved relative to phase 2. Some additional message interactions to support the new set of transactions, which Bob touched upon. And the transaction support of this phase, the focus area is claims, prior authorization, benefit enrollment, and premium payments. So these transactions are the focus of this phase. And as Bob mentioned, this new phase connectivity rule is also a safe harbor, just like the phase 2 connectivity rule was a safe harbor. You can have other methods of connectivity with which you can conduct these transactions as long as you offer out this method to your trading partners. Next slide, please. So the applicability of this connectivity rule is still business-to-business exchange of administrative transactions. And what's shown in these diagrams is two primary models. Model 1 is where a client submits directly to a server. A client in this case is a provider, and the server is a health plan. And Model 2, shown at the middle, is one where you have an intermediary such as a clearinghouse. And the other diagram at the far right shows a situation where a consumer is interacting directly with a business. This would be a situation where a patient is interacting with a business portal. This is not an area where this is not a scenario where you would apply the connectivity rule. So it's intended mainly for B2B client-server interactions. Next slide, please. So the conformance requirements around the phase 4 are defined in the infrastructure rules in phase 4. Connectivity rule happens to be one of the infrastructure rules, but there are others that are specific to each transaction. And within those infrastructure rules, the technical roles of each stakeholder type have been defined. For example, what you see in this diagram here at the bottom is the help plan typically plays the role of a server. That's the minimum technical role for a health plan. A healthcare provider plays the role of a client, and a clearinghouse, which acts as the intermediary, plays the role of a client and the server. So the side of the clearinghouse that faces the provider acts as a server, and the side that faces the health plan acts as a client. So in that sense, it has both roles. Next slide, please. So the progression of the various phases of the connectivity role is shown in this visual. On the left-hand side, the rectangle there shows the scenario before the application of any of the core connectivity rules. So there's a variety of methods in use for exchanging administrative transactions. The application of the phase 1 connectivity rule shown in the next rectangle. So basically that phase standardized on the use of the public internet, but there was still a lot of variations in the use of the message envelope and security. So phase 2 built on that foundation to provide a more prescriptive message envelope and security, but it provided two message envelopes, namely SOAP and MIME, and then two methods of authenticating the client to the server, namely X.509 and username password. Phase 4 connectivity rule shown at the far right further improves upon phase 2 by providing a single envelope method, that is SOAP and WSDL, and a single authentication method, that is X.509 over SSL. So by doing that, it is improving interoperability and security for the conduct of these administrative transactions. Next slide, please. So now we're going to drill down further into the connectivity rule requirements. If we can keep going to the next slide. So this diagram here is the OSI model shown in the far right that shows the 7 layers of the OSI model. The first and second layers are the physical and data link layer. The third and fourth are the network and transport layer. Fifth and sixth are the session and presentation level layers, and layer 7 is the application layer. Now the focus of phase 1 connectivity rule was layers 3 and 4 by standardizing on the use of the public internet. Phase 2 connectivity rule built on that to provide a prescriptive envelope and security in layers 5 and 6. And phase 4 continues to provide more prescriptive standards for the use of message envelope and security in layers 5 and 6. So that continues to be the scope of the connectivity rule in phase 4. So the diagram on the left shows a typical flow of a payload. At the top left of the diagram is a sender composing a payload such as an X12 administrative payload, and then sending it through the message encapsulation layer, layers 5 and 6, and then message transport layer, layers 3 and 4, and then across the network it goes to the recipient, which provides the reverse of that processing by removing the encapsulation of the message envelope and then sending the payload onto the receiving application for processing. This diagram, of course, doesn't show layers 1 and 2 of the OSI model, which is assumed to be below the layers 3 and 4. Next slide, please. So this is another view of the same information in a sort of a layered or a cross-section view. Shown at the middle is the message payload or content. Typically that would be an X12 in the case of an administrative transaction, but that could also be some other format file because the connectivity rule is designed to be payload agnostic. So the layer outside of that, shown in blue in the rectangle, is the message envelope layer. This is the SOAP and MTOM message envelope. And then the layer one level outside that is the transport, the HTTP and SSL layer. And the final layer that's shown in green is the public internet, that's the TCP/IP layer. So between these 4 layers shown in this diagram, that's pretty much all of the layers that we deal with. Keeping in mind that the message payload content is really an application level focus. The focus of the connectivity role is the message envelope, transport, and network. Next slide, please. So there's 2 primary message interaction patterns, the synchronous and asynchronous. The synchronous message interaction pattern is used for real-time request-response interactions between clients and servers. This is one where the client sends a request and waits on the response to arrive on the same connection. And the asynchronous method is one where the client sends a request and it doesn't wait for a response on the same connection, but it picks up the response in a separate connection. So this would be an example of a batch mode message interaction where you have the submission happening on one session and the pickup of the results happening on a totally different session. Next slide, please. So this table sort of shows the focus areas in terms of the X12 transactions within the various core phases. Shown on the far right is the focus area of phase 4. This includes the claim transaction, prior authorization, premium payment, and enrollment transactions. Phase 3, which is the middle column, that was focused on the healthcare payment advice, also known as electronic remittance advice, the ERA or 835. And phase 1 and 2 are focused on eligibility inquiry and claim status transactions. Now, we need to keep in mind that phase 4 is still a safe harbor. Other methods of connectivity can be used to conduct the phase 4 transactions that are the focus of the phase 4, as long as you offer out the phase 4 safe harbor to your trading partners. The other thing to keep in mind is the phase 2 connectivity rule still continues to be a requirement as per the Affordable Care Act, and for the conduct of eligibility, claim status, and ERA transactions, you continue to need to support the phase 2 connectivity rule. Although for the purpose of the phase 4 connectivity rule safe harbor requirements, you can consider the phase 2 connectivity rule as being one of the methods of connectivity outside of the safe harbor requirements of phase 4. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of a busy slide. It's further drilled down into the technical requirements of phase 4 and how that relates to the requirements of the previous phases. Just to describe the organization of this information, the column on the left-hand side shows the various layers or functional layers of the connectivity rule, and the other 3 columns have the technical requirements for each of the core phases. Core phase 1 connectivity requirements, and then phase 2 and 3 had the same connectivity requirements, and phase 4 requirements are on the far right. And the cells in this table that have a bold yellow highlight, those indicate some of the new requirements or updates to the requirements that were applied in this phase relative to the previous phase 2 and phase 3. So if we go down this table, you'll notice that the network and transport requirements are identical. The transport security requirements have been enhanced in phase 4 in terms of being slightly stronger, allowing TLS 1.1 or higher in lieu of SSL version 3 for both stronger security as well as FIPS 140-2 compliance. In the area of submitter authentication, the use of username password has been discontinued in phase 4. There was convergence on the use of X.509 over SSL and TLS. The envelope and attachment standards, which is the next row here, convergence on SOAP and MTOM for both real-time and batch. The use of HTTP and MIME has been discontinued in this phase. There's been some implementer feedback-based enhancements or improvements in the clarity of the language used for metadata description, as well as some of the checksum field. The SHA-1 was used in previous phase. In this phase, phase 4, SHA-2 can also be used for FIPS 140-2 compliance or for stronger message integrity. In the area of message interactions, both batch and real-time interactions have been preserved. Some additional message interactions for push and pull interactions for 820 and 834 transactions. We'll get into more details around that in a subsequent slide, but I just wanted to mention that there's additional message interactions in phase 4 to support these new transactions. Error codes have been updated in phase 4 relative to phase 2, again based on implementer feedback and based on the fact that we've converged on SOAP, and some of the error codes that were needed for HTTP MIME are no longer necessary in this phase. The rest of the requirements are the same, so we can go to the next slide. So in phase 4, the processing mode requirements for these transactions that are a focus of this phase have been defined in a separate document, which is referenced from the connectivity rule. This is called the processing mode and payload type tables document. And you'll notice that the requirements for the 837, the claim, the enrollment transaction 834, and the premium payment 820, they all have the same processing mode requirements. Batch mode is required and real-time mode is optional. And for the prior authorization transaction, the 278, either real-time mode or batch mode must be implemented, but both of them can be implemented, may be implemented. One of the two modes must be implemented. Next slide, please. So here we show an example of a SOAP real-time request as it appears over the wire. Shown at the top in blue highlights is the HTTP headers of the SOAP request. Shown in the middle is the SOAP message envelope with the area that's highlighted in yellowish green, showing the core connectivity specific metadata that describes the payload type and processing mode, etc. And the section at the bottom shown in yellow, that's the MTOM attachment, and that's the one that contains the actual payload, if you will, the X12-278 transaction in this case. This is a real-time request. Next slide, please. So here we see an example of an interaction between a client and a server. In this case, the client is the healthcare provider shown on the left, and the server is a health plan shown on the right. So the provider sends a real-time submission of a 278 request, and the health plan responds with, depending on whether there was an error at the HTTP level, an HTTP error might be sent back. If that was successful, there was no errors at the HTTP level, You might get an error at the core envelope processing level. If not, the response may be a successful response with the corresponding payload type value, depending on the level of validation that's performed by the health plan. Here we have TA1 for the interchange level error, 999 for a functional group, and the 278 response. So those are the possibilities. Next slide, please. So this is an visual that shows the push and the pull message interactions, which are newly introduced in this phase for supporting the 820, that's the premium payment, and the enrollment 834 transactions. So the interaction pattern on the left shows a generic push where a health plan sponsor or an employer, for example, would do a push acting as a client. The push of the batch containing the 820 or the 834 transaction goes to a health plan, which acts as a server in this case, and the client then retrieves the corresponding acknowledgement or error message in a separate retrieve request sent later on to the server. So this is an example of that generic push interaction. Now shown at the bottom is the generic pull interaction where the roles are somewhat reversed. Here the health plan plays the role of a client, and it sends a retrieval request to the health plan sponsor for the 820 or 834 batch, and the health plan sponsor responds with the batch, and then the health plan processes the batch and sends back a 999 or error based on the processing of the batch. So in the first interaction, the batch starts by getting pushed. In the second interaction, the batch is pulled by the health plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of the security enhancements in this phase, I touched upon this earlier. Submitter authentication has been strengthened by the fact that username password, which is a weaker form of authentication relative to the X.509 certificate-based authentication, that has been phased out. So the convergence has been on X.509, which is a stronger method of authentication. In terms of the transport level security, the use of TLS 1.1 or higher as an option gives you the ability to be either FIPS 142 compliance or just to support a stronger method of transport security to meet your enterprise security needs. Also, the fact that SHA-2 can now be used for payload integrity in lieu of SHA-1 gives you the stronger payload level integrity protection for the batch payload submissions. So the diagram shows a situation where a submitter connects to a federal entity using a FIPS 140-2 compliant connection that uses TLS 1.1 or higher and SHA-2 instead of SHA-1. And then the same client may be connecting to a commercial health plan that may or may not use a FIPS 140-2 compliant connection. So it could still use that stronger method of transport security if it so desires, but that's optional for the commercial health plans. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to pass it back to Jessica or Drew.
And thank you, Raja, and I will pass it back to Drew for our first polling question.
Great. Thank you very much, Raja and Jessica. This brings us to our first of two polling questions that we have for you today. And this question asks, what voluntary Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rule implementation planning stage or stages do you plan to complete by the end of next year? And what will happen is I will launch this poll here, and you will see a box up here on your screen where you can answer one or many of these responses, and we'll just pause for a brief second or two for everyone to respond, and then I'll share the results and might ask for some commentary. Take about 5 more seconds. Just go ahead and answer right on your screens. Take about 3 more seconds. Okay, I see about half of you have voted. Try and take 1 more second. Just go ahead and log your response, and I'll share the results. All right. Well, let's close the poll and share the results with everybody. Well, it's about kind of an even split between two, but 38% are saying internal education and awareness, followed by 36% saying that they have no plans or they're unsure, 33% saying analysis and planning or systems design, 21% saying systems implementation or integration and testing, and 13% saying deployment and maintenance. And Bob, I've got you in the room. What do you see from these results?
I think this is these look great to me. It looks like the industry is really looking into their gap analysis and preparing for, if not even starting to begin the remediation process for their systems. We hope that the core resources that we have available for free on our website can help. Don't forget to use those. They include a planning guide, a gap analysis guide, as well as a whole host of FAQs. All of those resources are definitely available on our website. So looks great.
Great. And we'll carry on, and I'll pass it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Drew. So I will be moderating this next portion of the webinar, and I'm very happy to be talking to our speakers, Faye, Raja, and Bob. And we're also joined by Taha Andrawala, who's a Senior Project Associate with us here at CORE. So let's begin. And my first question is for Faye. So Faye, you just walked us through your planning process for Phase 4 implementation of the connectivity rules. So what would you say to other implementers out there who are listening to this webinar and who are just starting out in their planning? What are words of wisdom for them? Any best practices you can share?
Well, sure. So, so I think the number one thing is to understand the stakeholder type. PocketDoc is a clearinghouse, and as a vendor, we have the option to do both information requester, information source, and not sure if it was not very obvious that you could actually split up the certifications and do one first and then the other. So definitely looking at the CAQH supplementary resources, as Bob mentioned, such as a quick start guide and the gap analysis, which drills down into the requirements and the connectivity rule that we just went through. So you're able to, again, proactively plan and project plan the entire testing. So in terms of best practices, again, going back to the planning and utilizing not only those supplementary resources, but CAQH, Taha was a really great resource, as well as the EdEffect folks, which is the testing site. They were really instrumental in making sure we were on the right path and what we were submitting and made sense. So just utilizing what's on hand and communicating.
That's great, Faye, and it's gratifying for us to hear that our resources are being used and that we can be helpful. So my next follow-up question is for Taha. So Taha, we just learned about PocketDoc's experience, and they just talked about their best practices, and one of their challenges was kind of figuring out how to certify. So can you speak to our audience members who are thinking of certifying as a server or clearinghouse? What should they be thinking about?
Sure. So piggybacking off what Faye was talking about. So base certification is stakeholder specific. So one of the key elements is kind of identifying your stakeholder type, whether you're if you're a clearinghouse or vendor, determine if you're on the health plan facing or provider facing. And then the next step is kind of determining how your organization then processes the transactions. Are you the sender? Are you the receiver? So all that kind of integrates into identifying how you should actually certify. So those are key questions to think about. So we have, once you determine that, we have FAQs and also a gap analysis tool that will help kind of guide you through the process. And I like to echo what Faye was saying, that gap analysis tool will help you identify which of the operating rules will apply to your organization, and you can use that tool to assess and address any gaps for your organization. Additionally, when you actually get into the testing requirements, our Phase 4 authorized testing vendor has designed the system in the sense that you're able to kind of identify and select a profile that will help guide you through the testing requirements based on how your organization processes the transaction.
Thank you, Taha. My next question is for Raja. Raja, your presentation is great, a terrific overview of all of these technical requirements. But for me as a layperson, some of this stuff is a little bit confusing and hard to understand. What are the areas that you've found in your experience are the most challenging, the most difficult to understand?
Thanks, Jessica. And I think some of this depends on the experience the organization has in terms of whether they've already implemented the previous phase of the connectivity rule versus are they looking at it from a new implementer standpoint, where they're coming at it from, are they building it from phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. But for those that have already implemented previous phases, the areas that may be somewhat new in this phase are for those that use username password, for example, as a method of authentication in previous phase. In this phase, the fact that the authentication has converged on X.509, so there may be a little bit of learning curve associated with some of the security enhancements of this phase, and that may be an area that we can help with in terms of, we have developed many FAQs that explain some of the security aspects. The other aspect that may be a little bit of area of confusion or challenge is the safe harbor requirements of this phase, and how that relates to the safe harbor requirements of, say, the phase 2 connectivity rule. So just to give a little bit of context on those two safe harbors, this new safe harbor applies to the 4 transactions that are the focus of phase 4: claims, prior authorization, enrollment, and premium payment. And you can continue to use other methods of connectivity to conduct these transactions, as long as the safe harbor provision of this this new phase you can offer out to your trading partners. And again, keep in mind, this is at this point just a voluntary adoption and not been mandated yet. Phase 2, on the other hand, has been mandated as part of the ACA requirements, and that happens to be a safe harbor as well. Although the focus of phase 2 is eligibility and claim status and ERA transactions, for which that connectivity rule still applies, although you can conduct those transactions using other methods as long as you offer out that safe harbor connectivity method to your trading partners. So it's there's some nuances there, and we have developed several FAQs to describe them, and that may be an area that we can provide further guidance through FAQs and education and so on.
Thank you, Raja. Yeah, thank you. In past webinars where we've asked the polling question, what areas are the most challenging, the ones that you just mentioned come up. So that was very helpful. I have a follow-up question for Faye. You've talked about your challenges, kind of figuring out how to certify, what your stakeholder group was, but during implementation, did you have any challenges, and if so, were there more technical or more in terms of time and resources?
Yeah, there were both technical and resource challenges. So although PocketDoc has the infrastructure and authentication standards that Raja mentioned in place for phase 4, the main technical challenge was more implementing some of these changes that were not currently being used or adopted, right, with our existing trading partners. So we worked through these changes and sort of work, put the work aside. So that was probably the main challenge, knowing that we're sort of ahead of the game here. And then in terms of resource planning, you know, we just sort of had to ticket the testing and wait for our developer to pick up the request or the testing for when they were available. But we got through it, and you know, it takes some time. So we allocated a few weeks just for knowing that the different people involved were going to be available at different times.
Well, thanks, Faye. And you know, this is helpful for people that are kind of in the beginning stages of this to know that these are the things that they might have to overcome when they're going through this. So that's really helpful. And Raja, you know, from your perspective, are there any specific test plans or testing requirements that the potential implementers should be, you know, spending extra time on or focusing on?
I think, again, I think it somewhat depends on where the implementation is starting from. So if an organization has already implemented any of the previous phases, then I guess your focus of testing can be on some of the new features or the new security enhancements, such as the X.509 client authentication. That's one, and then the fact that this phase uses MTOM, for example, for both real-time and batch. So you could focus on some of the enhancements in this phase to make sure that you have implemented them right, and they are the implementation is interoperable with your trading partners and such. And also some of the newer message interactions, such as the push and the pull. You can decide which of those models suits your business use case, and then test for interoperability with your trading partners for that chosen message interaction pattern. Whereas if you're an organization that hasn't implemented the previous phases, then the testing really has to happen ground up from the transport, the message, the security, the envelope, and the messaging interactions, including some of the previous phase requirements as well as the phase 4 requirements.
Thank you, Raja. So a follow-up question for Taha, you know, since we're talking about certification. So what are the benefits to pursuing phase 4 certification? What are the advantages in this environment that we're in now where it's voluntary?
Sure. So becoming phase 4 certified shows that your organization is an industry leader with administrative simplification, and demonstrating commitment that you're maximizing the efficiencies afforded by the operating rules. Further, phase 4 operating rules were developed by the industry, so that and pursuing phase 4 certification assures to your customers and trading partners that you are using industry-developed business rules and best practices to offer quality infrastructure and deliver secure transactions. And lastly, I'd like to point out that if you're already thinking about certifying for phases 1, 2, or 3, consider adding on phase 4 as well simultaneously, as this will save time and resources in implementation and testing, as we've heard from our speakers, that they build out the same infrastructure requirements from past phases.
Thank you, Taha. That makes a lot of sense. And so for a follow-up question for Bob, so what technical skills are needed by an organization that's thinking about or in the process of implementing the phase 4 connectivity rules?
So that's a good question. I think that similar to what Faye and Raja and Taha have mentioned, that since many of the requirements are building off the previous phases, there's not necessarily a lot of changes. If we look at the technology that Raja went through in a pretty detailed way, we see that actually username and password has been removed. Mine, multi-part, has been removed. So phase 4 is actually easier to implement than the previous phases, so that's helpful. Also, Raja mentioned the additional security requirements or the options that you have for security. So TLS 1.1 in lieu of SSL. Now that gets into some really technical security requirements that might be something new to different organizations. Again, part of that's going to be working through those different divisions within your organization, not just your connectivity, but also some of the security requirements that you have, what type of data that's being in those transactions. It might be different parts of organizations. I've seen this through especially large health plans. They have different ways of doing things for an eligibility and premium payment transactions versus claims. And looking at that in a kind of a holistic approach and looking at resources across the organization, because again, those divisions that manage premium payment versus those divisions within your organization that promote claims or connect claims are very, very different. So that will be something that as project managers you have to consider as well.
Thanks, Bob. And so my last question's for Faye. PocketDoc went through implementing the connectivity requirements in phases 2 and now 4. So what advice would you give to those organizations considering implementing the phase 4 rules who have not implemented the previous connectivity rules? Will their planning efforts differ, and if so, in what way?
Yeah, I think it would definitely take a bit longer. The planning efforts are definitely crucial, in terms of what we just mentioned, allocating the resources. And, it may vary because, having to implement phase 2, you may have more cross-team collaboration with your DevOps or whatever IT professionals needed to make sure you're at the standards required. But yeah, so it really depends on where they are at in their efforts.
Thank you.
Already. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, Fan. Forgive me for interrupting you. Were you done? Yeah, sorry about that. And I think, if you guys, anybody out there is thinking about it and is unsure, have any questions about this, please feel free to contact us and we'll help you out, case by case. And now I'm going to send it back to Drew for our next polling question.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And very informative dialogue there. And so our last and second and final polling question of the webinar asks a little bit about what was just discussed. And it asks, which of the following would you consider to be the biggest challenge to your organization's implementation of the phase 4 470 connectivity rule? And just like last time, I will launch this poll right now. And please take a minute or a second or two to log your answer. And I'll share the results and maybe Bob or somebody to comment on the results. Let's take just a couple seconds. Try and break 50% participation in the poll here, up to about 35. Here we go. Take a couple more seconds. Just 1 or 2 more seconds, and I'll share the results here. All right, I will close the poll. Let's take a look at what people said. So 31% are indicating that they're indicate having enough time and staff for implementation. 25% saying that the decision makers have not given the go-ahead. 22% say fully understanding the requirements, of course, and then 13% saying no major challenges, and 9% saying this question isn't applicable. So Bob, what wisdom can you provide us?
I think it's exactly what Faye mentioned. Oftentimes, the biggest challenge are resources, and that's time and dollars to make sure that your systems can be mitigated, migrated to new technology, or also making sure that you're within the mandate for the previous role. So moving to phase 4 is going to be a challenge with those resources, as most projects are. But another important point here, too, is the decision makers haven't given the green light for the project. We understand that since this phase has not yet been mandated, a lot of people are in the wait and see what happens with our new administration coming in is going to have an impact on any sort of regulatory requirements. Rest assured that much of the industry is looking at Phase 4 and are looking at ensuring that they can build on the efficiencies that they built for their previous transactions in the previous phases of 1, 2, and 3. And this just extends those requirements basically to these other 4 transactions. Again, all very important transactions, particularly the claims and the prior authorization. Another important point is to fully understand the requirements. And hopefully from Taha's feedback as well as from Faye, you learned that there are lots of resources all available for free on our website, including FAQs, the gap analysis, and planning guide. All of these tools are developed specifically for people in your shoes that need to know more, that need to understand more, that are going to work on these projects. And they're hopefully, and the feedback that we've received is very positive, that they're written in a way that makes it very easy to understand. And I'll also thank you to Jessica and Drew, because they also develop an education program where we have lots of webinars, several a month, that are all available for free on our website too, to download and listen to specific topics, especially for Phase 4. You'll find several of those we've done throughout the year.
And, I'd like to mention, since Bob just said this, the slides and the recordings for all of these webinars are available for free. And there was a webinar at the end of June that was specific to the business case for implementing the Phase 4 rules. And I think that one might be helpful as you're talking to your executives, trying to make a case for implementing the Phase 4 rules. Thank you, Drew, for the polling question. And now we have some time for Q&A. Please submit your questions by typing them into the questions panel of your dashboard, and let's get started. So we have a couple of very technical questions that I am going to direct to Raja. Raja, the first question is, does client refer to a workstation or a human user? Can a client be an internal workstation or a web browser requesting a web page from an internet web server?
Okay, that's a good question, and in fact, it's one of the frequent questions that we encounter. The scope of the connectivity rule is really a business-to-business or a client-server interaction, where there is a client that sits on in one organization that makes a request to a server that sits in another organization, and that client is typically not it's not a browser, and it's definitely not an end user, nor is it a workstation. It's a program that runs in your organization or in the sending organization. For example, in the case of a provider organization, this client may be either in the provider organization or in a vendor that serves the provider organization that's acting on behalf of the provider that makes a request to a health plan, for instance, in the case of a 278 transaction or an eligibility inquiry transaction.
Thank you, Raja. That's helpful, and hang on tight because I got a couple more for you. The next question for you is, can I add additional SOAP headers?
The SOAP headers in the connectivity rule, yes, you can add some headers. The WSDL and the XSD are both normative. You cannot modify the WSDLs or the XSD schemas. You can add SOAP headers if you have an additional field of metadata that you wish to use, and then you would need to provide the information about the SOAP header in your companion guide, in connectivity companion guide. And the way it's specified in the connectivity rule is that any entity that doesn't need to use that needs to be able to ignore that SOAP header if it's not something that the entity can accept. Then that needs to be specified in the connectivity guide as well.
Thank you, Raja. And so we are out of time for today. I'd like to thank our speakers and thank you, the audience, as well, for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Here's a list of our upcoming webinars. Feel free to click on those links and register. If you have questions or are interested in learning more about CORE, go to our website or email us at core@caqh.org. There are also lots more resources contained in the appendix. There are about 50 more slides that will be very helpful to you as you're planning your implementation, so check those out. And finally, please take a moment after the session to fill out our short evaluation survey. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.